Good morning, still, I think. And today, I am Maria Hernandez. I'm a second-year student at College-Kingwood, and I want to invite you to stand on the shoulders of a giant. And I want to look at David Rittenhouse's life. To do so, I want to go back in time a little bit. And I want to take you to a time where America was not yet America. And I want to start by asking you a question. If I say the phrase, the American's Newton, well, Dr. Barr already did the spoiler for me. But anyway, I think that if you hear the phrase, David Rittenhouse would not come to your mind. And I think that's because he's actually underlooked in the American history books. So one thing that I found in my research and the thing that made me look into him was the fact that scholars were calling him the first astronomer, the first genius that America did. And I was very impressed because as a person that liked astronomy itself, I never heard his name before. So one thing that I found was that he not only was a brilliant scientist, but he was actually an activist in the American Revolution. And not only that, but he came from immigrant family. So as an immigrant myself and a person that loves Newton and a person that likes politics, I did my research question, in what ways did Rittenhouse, Newton-inspired military and scientific contributions influence the American victory in the American Revolution? And how did his life reflect the broader influence of these immigrants' ideas in the birth and eventually in the success of the United States of America? But to do so, I did a lot of research. And I tried to narrow it down because it was a broad topic to begin with. But I tried to narrow it down to just 4 topics. So the first one is just a biography. He doesn't have many biographies. That was the most extensive one that I could find. The second one is just an intersection of the immigration and how immigration is actually important in the United States. And the last 2, actually thanks Dr. Barr again, it was science and the founding fathers and inventing America. But something that I noticed is that even though I did a lot of research in these 2 books, Rittenhouse is not that mentioned. He's only mentioned according to other people, like for example, Thomas Jefferson, but not in himself. So my research tried to to fill the gap. So why, if his influence was so important, why is he so neglected in these books? And to do so, I obviously had to, well, look into his life. So David Rittenhouse was born in 1732 in a small town in Norrington in Pennsylvania, and he was born to immigrant parents. But the first thing that every biographer says about him is that he was deeply influenced by Principia, by Isaac Newton. And one thing about this is that, so Isaac Newton was influential in his life. He based all his research on this topic. But the thing about this is that he read a translation. So all the topics that he read was actually intellectual exchange. The other thing that he did was that even though he was a scholar and a good one too, he was self-taught. So all the research that he did on himself, it was actually something that he didn't have any teacher to teach him all. And it was actually impressive to me to find out that by the age of 8, he was actually inventing machines. By the age of 13, he was already mastered in every Newton's law. And by the age of 17, he started making clocks, as you can see. But his passion, and I relate to this a lot, his passion became in the stars. So he will actually, as well as the clocks, he actually wanted to do something more with this. And this is where it comes what I try to call his making of a genius. So why was he a genius? Why do scholars tend to call him a genius? Actually, even though he was very much inclined to astronomy, the first thing that he did was actually political. And I'm pretty sure, I was not born here, but I'm pretty sure that you are familiar with the Mason and Dixon line. If you're not, it's just the line that it draws the line between the free states and the slave states. And his name doesn't appear in any articles that I read, but then in the biographies made by scholars, he was actually one of the main inventors of this. So why was he so neglected again? Then, there was only a few parts. He did this when he was on his 20s, but the big thing that caught the eye of the scholars was actually the myth of the orrery. And again, this is where my big gap came from. So why is his political life so neglected, and why does the scholars mainly focus on the science? Well, of course, they focus on the science because the science itself is really big. So let's not try to make this so complex. The orrery, we need to talk about this. The orrery is basically a mechanical object that traces the solar system. So you can see every planet at any time. He was not the inventor, but he made it so good that he's basically the first name that pops up if you put an orrery in Google. And this is basically because his orrery, you could see the position of the planets at any point in time. So you could see the planets in the past, in present, and future. Not only that, but his orrery was very detailed. So it has from Jupiter moons to Saturn rings. And this is when, like I said, this is when his path to a genius began to make, because he started gaining popularity among Americans. And one American that was deeply influenced by Rittenhouse was actually Thomas Jefferson. And in his own words, he says, "We have supposed Rittenhouse second to no astronomer living," supposing to Newton, because Thomas Jefferson was a Newtonian himself. But also, according to the orrery, he said, "He has not indeed made a world, but he has, by imitation, approached nearer its maker than any man who has lived from creation to this day." But one thing that I noticed was that even though this was his first thing to the astronomy, a scholar says that this is the moment where he began his path to popularity, not just in America, but in the world. So the transit to Venus was basically, to put it simply, it's an observation that they made to know their place in the world. So where do the humans come from? It's basically a distance from the sun to the earth. And he was the one that made the telescope that you see right there. He made the clock to do the observations, and he measures it so precisely that even now, 300 years later, his measurements are still good. But here it comes. Okay, his scientific is very accomplished, but what about his political influence? And this is what I call the paradox. So he was indeed a big scientist, and in 1774, they petitioned the first public astronomer. So the first public astronomer that America had was actually David Rittenhouse. This was there when he was making the orrery. But with the petition of the public astronomer, he did not do astronomy things. He actually did political things. And this is where it led to 1 year later, he was called to be the engineer in the community, in the Committee of Safety, where he made a lot of fortifications, ammunitions, rifles, and things that were actually going to do things in the war. And he was a big key in the Pennsylvania Congress. And that's why he was called also to be participating in the Continental Congress and the Board of War, where he not just did inventions, but actually he made strategies to be in this war and to proceed with it. And then, with all the things that he did, in 1782, he was part of, like you can see, of the American Academy of Art and Science. And this is important because he was part of this with peers like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. So if he was with these people, why is he not mentioned among the founding fathers, for example? Or why is he not mentioned more in the history books? Not only that, but I found out that just like Newton, he was the director of the United States Mint. And he was actually the designer of the first mint. So if you have money in your hands, you should maybe thank David Rittenhouse. But of course, everything comes to an end. And only 4 years later than that, Rittenhouse died. And even though he did all of this, he was died in his observatory. So with this, this is pretty much my conclusion, but also it made me reflect a lot on what are we doing with American history? Why are we not looking more into the scientific part of the American Revolution? Because it took a lot of it. And this also, with his immigrant ideas and with the intellectual exchange that he had, he did a lot to shape the American identity. And not in my words, but in Benjamin Rush's eulogy when Rittenhouse died, he said, "The United States of America sympathized in our grief, for his name gave a splendor to the American character." And so I think that for future research, we could see if we can feel more of this gap, of these overlooked figures that are very important in our daily life, but still, for some reason, we do not look at them. For example, Nancy Roman, who was very big in the construction of the telescope web, but still his contributions to astronomy are not that looked upon. And of course, two other political figures, just as Thomas Jefferson and his Newtonian influence. But before I go, and I think this is very important, and a thing that I really want to mention is that this is still a debate today. Immigration is still a thing that we talk about again and again. And I think it's worth remembering that the fact that people come to America is for the better future, but we cannot look into the future without looking into our past. So we need to remember that nearly all Americans have come from ancestors that braved the oceans, and that immigration is not just to American past, but it's also a bridge to American future. These are my references, and thank you so much.